Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds made up, but totally isn't. I was wandering through a quiet back alley in Kyoto, hands still warm from a steaming bowl of udon, when I passed a small tea house with a paper door that slid open with a soft esichichichge. Light spilled out like it had been waiting just for me. I wasn't looking for anything deep, just somewhere to sit and thaw my fingers. But inside that cramped little room, barely big enough for two, I heard a word that caught me completely off guard. Mimigiki. To be honest, I thought it was the name of a comedy act or something. I even glanced around for hidden cameras. But the man across from me, serene as a statue, simply poured a cup of tea and said, "I'm a professional listener. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where and when these stories reach people. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together." He moved with the grace of someone who's done the same thing every day for decades. Pouring it carefully. He didn't rush me, didn't ask questions. He was just there, like a polite, well-dressed wall with excellent posture. I finally broke the silence. "What exactly do you do?" "I listen to people, to whatever they want to say. Like a therapist? No advice. No judgment. No records. I just listen." That was it. Just one simple answer, but sent my brain spinning. Later, I'd find out that professional listening wasn't some quirky new job title made up by a startup. It had roots going all the way back to medieval Japan, a time of samurai, ritual tea ceremonies, and wooden sandals. Imagine walking through the foggy streets of Kyoto, slipping into a candlelit tea house, and sitting across from someone who doesn't speak unless you do. Someone trained not to interrupt or react, just to be there, fully and silently present. Sounds kind of poetic, right? Well, it was, but also kind of risky. See, medieval Japan wasn't exactly a place for open conversations. Samurai were supposed to uphold honor and restraint. Merchants had to watch their every word. Women, for the most part, weren't expected to speak at all. So, when people needed to let things out, anger, heartbreak, regrets, they had to find someone who wouldn't respond, wouldn't gossip, wouldn't write it down. Just someone with good ears. Some historians believe the very first listeners were shrine maidens, or miko, whose job was originally to hear the gods. Over time, they started listening to humans instead. That shift, from divine messages to human confessions, might have been the true beginning of this unusual craft. And yes, historians still argue about this. Was the first paid listener a miko? A monk? A retired court lady? No one agrees. But by the Kamakura period, the profession was already a thing, if not officially, then quietly accepted. They didn't take notes. They didn't give diagnoses. But they had techniques. Burning incense to calm the nerves, serving tea in rhythmic intervals to create space for emotion, even adjusting posture and eye contact to signal attentiveness. Of course, not every session was graceful. One listener's personal journal included this gem. Today's client repeated one sentence for 2 hours. "My boss is an idiot." Whether it was venting, grieving, or just unraveling tangled thoughts out loud. These listeners created a space that didn't exist anywhere else in society. They were like emotional safe zones, wrapped in tatami and steam. Back in that Kyoto tea house, the old man refilled my cup. Still didn't ask my name. Still didn't ask what I came for. "If you don't want to talk," he said softly, "I can listen to silence too." In a world that never stops shouting, that moment taught me the quiet weight of listening. I left that little tea house with more questions than answers, and, oddly, feeling a little lighter. But as I wandered through the narrow Kyoto alleyways, one thing kept echoing in my head. He listens, but he doesn't fix. That really stuck with me. I mean, what kind of job is that? Listening sounds like something your best friend does when they're only half paying attention, scrolling on their phone. But this guy, it was his profession. So I started digging, asking around, poking through old books and archives like a curious raccoon. Turns out, professional listeners in medieval Japan weren't therapists, weren't priests, and definitely weren't spies. But they kind of overlapped with all of them. They weren't there to offer wisdom. but they often heard people's deepest thoughts. They didn't serve the gods, but they were treated with a kind of quiet reverence. And even though they held a treasure chest of secrets, they weren't allowed to use them, not even for leverage or survival. Their whole job? Be there. Listen. Don't interrupt. Don't fix. But hold up. You might be thinking, why would anyone pay someone just to sit there and not give feedback? Well, welcome to the wild paradox of the human mind. People didn't want judgment. They didn't want pity. They just wanted to unload. See, during the Muromachi period, that's roughly 14th to 16th century, Japan was socially rigid. The class system was like a brick wall. You were either on top of it or crushed underneath. And expressing emotion publicly? Huge no-no, especially if you were a samurai. Now imagine you're a samurai. You're expected to be the embodiment of stoicism, loyalty, and restraint. You just lost your best friend in battle. You're questioning your lord's sanity, and your sword is duller than your love life. Who do you tell? Exactly. Enter the professional listener. They weren't hired to advise. In fact, offering unsolicited advice was considered a breach of etiquette. The idea was that humans, when given a safe space to speak freely, often found their own clarity. Sounds suspiciously modern, doesn't it? Here's a fun twist. Some listeners were hired not just for emotional relief, but for political strategy. Let's say you're a merchant trying to seal a huge deal, but your client is moody, distracted, and clearly wrestling with something personal. So before the negotiation, you quietly pay a professional listener to sit with them for an hour. Let them vent. Clean the emotional slate. Boom! Business goes smoother. Was it manipulative? Maybe. But efficient? Absolutely. There's even a legend about a listener named Hashin, who was once invited to a daimyo's castle every full moon. Not to entertain, not to advise, just to sit on a cushion while the daimyo paced, muttered, and occasionally stared into the fire. When Hashin died, the daimyo reportedly fell into a deep depression. Not because he'd lost a friend, but because, as he put it, "My words now go nowhere." One scholar wrote, "To the Japanese ear, silence is not empty. It is a room where meaning waits." That still gives me chills. And no, not everyone understood it. Foreigners visiting Japan during the Edo period often mistook these quiet encounters as awkward or even lazy. One Dutch traveler noted in his diary, "The Japanese may speak together for hours without once raising their voice or seeming to reach a conclusion." Yeah, buddy, that was the conclusion. Historians still debate the exact structure of this profession. Did listeners train formally? Were they licensed? Did they keep logs? Some sources suggest there were informal networks, almost like guilds, where experienced listeners mentored younger ones. Others believe it was more solitary, a kind of spiritual calling. But one thing is consistent across records. They were trusted, deeply trusted. In a society obsessed with honor and face-saving, that trust was priceless. And no, they weren't mind readers. Some were just good with silence. Some had practice sitting still for hours. One anecdote mentions a listener who once sat for 6 straight hours without blinking more than twice. I mean, that's got to be an Olympic sport. So no, they weren't therapists, and they weren't spies. But they were essential, because in a world where talking could get you exiled, killed, or worse, misunderstood, having someone who simply sat there and heard you out, that was everything. So I'm sitting on a train the next morning, still half dreaming about last night's tea house encounter, when a thought hits me. How did this whole listening thing even start? I mean, someone had to be the first person to realize, hey, people have a lot of feelings and nowhere to put them. I should start charging for this. It's not like they had marketing back then. No flyers, no influencer posts saying, "Feeling overwhelmed? Book your local listener today." So I did what any curious night owl turned daytime history sleuth would do. I went to a temple, and that's where things got interesting. A monk, probably younger than he looked, told me something that stuck. In Shinto, listening is not just passive. It's purification. Turns out, long before anyone used the term professional listener, the act of listening was already part of Japan's oldest spiritual rituals. In Shinto ceremonies, there were women known as miko, shrine maidens, whose job wasn't just to dance or wave sacred paper wands. but to hear. They would listen to the spirits, interpret dreams, receive unspoken messages. They were literally trained to be vessels for other voices. And sometimes, when no spirits showed up, people came to talk to the Miko instead. Because, well, who better to hear your secrets than someone who already talks to gods? Academic circles still argue about this. Some say the Miko were the first proto-therapists. Others think that's projecting modern ideas onto ancient roles. But either way, it's clear, in Japan, listening has always been more than just waiting for your turn to speak. By the Heian period, roughly the 800s to 1100s, aristocrats were writing love letters filled with subtle poetry and emotional nuance, and still couldn't say half of what they were actually feeling. Courtly etiquette required elegance, restraint, and lots of reading between the lines. So when things got too overwhelming, you guessed it, they looked for someone outside the system, someone who would just listen. Sometimes that person was a servant, sometimes a retired monk, sometimes a low-ranking noble who'd fallen out of favor and decided, you know what? I'm just going to be really good at nodding meaningfully. What's wild is that this eventually became a whole skill set. Not officially. There were no degrees or ceremonies, but you'd hear whispers like, go to Ichijo Street, the woman in the third house. She listens, and not just listens, absorbs. People said things like, she takes your sorrow and releases it with the steam of her tea. Very poetic, very mysterious, possibly exaggerated, but definitely meaningful. In some cases, the act of listening was literally paired with tea ceremonies. You'd book an hour, drink matcha in a dim room, and talk while the server poured water and whisked the tea into soft green clouds. There were pauses built into the process, time for reflection, for emotion to surface. And because of the Confucian influence, which prized social harmony and hierarchy, you couldn't just rant to your boss or yell at your spouse. That would be chaos, disharmony, shame. But if you whispered those same complaints to someone trained to stay silent, somehow the balance remained intact. It's kind of beautiful, actually, the idea that society made space, not for shouting, not for fixing, but just for unburdening. One scholar I read, bless his footnotes, called this practice emotional composting. You give your listener the scraps of your soul, and they help it decay into something gentler, something useful. But it wasn't always gentle. There were risks. If the listener broke trust, word got around, fast. And in a culture where your honor could be shattered by a single rumor, the wrong whisper could ruin lives. That's why the best listeners weren't just good at staying quiet. They had entire reputations built on discretion. People called them silent walls, talking shadows, or sometimes just those who know too much but never say. And yet, despite their skill, they never became celebrities. No statues, no official titles, just a quiet legacy that drifted from temple courtyards to city tea houses, from whispered prayers to silent tears. So yeah, it didn't start as a job. It started as a ritual, and somewhere along the way, the ritual became necessary. Picture this. It's the middle of the Muromachi period. You're a middle-class merchant in a silk robe that you definitely overpaid for. Your rice supplier just bailed on a contract, and your teenage son wants to become a traveling flute player. You have feelings, but, and here's the kicker, you can't just vent to your family or the neighbors selling fish next door. That's how gossip starts. And in a city where social standing is basically your oxygen, one bad rumor can suffocate your entire household. So what do? You slip quietly into a tucked-away tea house, pay a small fee, and spend an hour talking to someone who will say absolutely nothing back. Welcome to a society where being heard was a luxury. It sounds strange now, right? We live in a world overflowing with voices. Social media, hot takes, live streams. It's a digital festival of talking. But back then, talking wasn't free. In fact, it was often dangerous. During much of medieval Japan, particularly in the feudal periods, hierarchy ruled everything. The way you walked, spoke, even looked at someone could all signal your class and your place in the order. Speaking out of turn wasn't rude, it was a threat. And expressing emotion? That was like opening a secret drawer in public. Risky, reckless, possibly fatal, depending on who heard you. That's why the idea of having someone who will hear your thoughts but never respond became so valuable. It wasn't just emotional relief. It was safe. And it's around this time that a strange market began to bloom, the trade of silence. Think about it. Most medieval economies revolved around physical goods. Rise silk swords, but this was different. A commodity you couldn't touch, couldn't see, and definitely couldn't return if you changed your mind. You were paying for someone's attention, and more specifically, for their ability to not talk back. There's even a rare scroll from the Ashikaga era where a noblewoman writes to her cousin, "I visited the quiet ear. He wore blue. He did not blink. I felt lighter afterward." That's it. No elaboration. Just the quiet ear. No name. No description. Just the role. Historians have debated endlessly about this phrase. Was quiet ear a nickname? A coded term? A poetic invention? The answer is we don't know. But the fact that she didn't explain it implies something big. Her cousin already understood what it meant. It wasn't just a service. It was an open secret. And get this, these listeners often worked in places with specific architecture. Rooms with paper walls, but thicker bases. Gardens planted in such a way that sound diffused. Water features nearby, to mask the voices with trickling streams. Whole environments were crafted to help people talk without being heard. Ironically, so they could be heard in a deeper way. And it wasn't cheap. You paid based on how long you wanted to speak, what time of day, and sometimes, rumor has it, how personal the subject was. Some listeners even had sliding scale prices depending on whether you just needed a vent or were about to confess something life-altering. This gave rise to the idea of emotional luxury. Just like expensive perfumes or rare tea blends, having someone truly listen to you was a mark of class. A subtle one, of course. You didn't boast about your listener the way you'd show off a new kimono, but in refined circles, it was known. She's had a listener since her husband's death. Oh, him? He keeps a listener on retainer twice a week. What's fascinating is that this emotional economy developed without any centralized structure. There was no listening guild, no listener certification exam, though honestly, that would have made a great anime plot. Instead, it's spread by reputation, one ear at a time. And still, to this day, scholars argue about just how formalized it ever got. Some believe it was part of temple services. Others think certain families passed the skill down like a secret recipe. And others suggest that every town had that one person everyone trusted to listen and never repeat a word. Regardless, the result was the same. In a society obsessed with control, someone quietly found a way to monetize chaos by doing nothing more than sitting still and listening. There's a story, half legend, half whispered fact, about a shogun who couldn't sleep, not from guilt or nightmares, mind you, but from the sheer pressure of being the guy in charge. Absolute authority sounds fun until every decision could spark a war, ruin a family, or shift the future of your entire domain. So what did he do? He hired a listener, not a priest, not an advisor, a listener, someone trained to sit, nod, and absorb. Every full moon, they'd meet in the back wing of the castle. The listener would arrive silently, dressed in plain robes, face downcast. The guards would step aside, no questions asked, and for hours, sometimes until sunrise, the shogun would talk. No one ever knew what he said. That was the point. This story gets retold a lot in tea houses and academic footnotes, always with a slight tweak. Sometimes the shogun cries. Sometimes he confesses past sins. Once, he supposedly draws his sword and screams into the tatama floor. But the listener never reacts, just sits there, still as a pond. Now, historians still argue over whether this ever really happened. Some say it's pure folklore. Others point to scattered records of high-ranking warlords employing silent attendants with vague job descriptions. The truth? We'll probably never know. But the story persists for a reason. Because it speaks to something universal. Even the most powerful people need someone to talk to, especially when they can't trust anyone else. In medieval Japan, betrayal wasn't just a plot twist. It was a career move. Samurai switched loyalties. Spies infiltrated families. Servants sold secrets for gold or survival. Trust was fragile, but a listener, a real one, they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by breaking that trust. That's why many of them lived simply, modestly, almost invisibly. You'd never see them at court or in paintings. They weren't glamorous. They were necessary and temporary, like shadows you hire. There's a chilling phrase I found in an old record. He who speaks to no one may speak to the ear. It shows up in a letter from a provincial lord to his son. The father warns him about court life, about smiling faces and hidden knives. And then, almost offhandedly, he says, "But if your thoughts turn to poison, seek the ear. Better a silent witness than a loud regret." Mic drop, feudal style. And while we're talking strategy, it's worth noting some daimyos use listeners like stress valves. They'd assign a listener to their most volatile retainers, not to spy, but to help them cool off. The logic was simple. A man who's had the chance to rant for 2 hours is less likely to commit seppuku or start a rebellion. It was preventative mental health care without the mental health vocabulary. Of course, this wasn't always so altruistic. Some listeners were chosen carefully, placed near rivals or courtiers with fragile egos. If those people ever slipped up, said something incriminating, well, maybe the listener would talk. Just once, for the right price. That's why the best listeners had one crucial skill beyond patience: neutrality. They couldn't seem too sympathetic, too interested, too cold either. They had to float in that perfect emotional limbo, present but not participating. You ever tried doing that at a family dinner? Imagine doing it every day with trained killers and insecure lords. One record even describes a listener who was so still during sessions that birds would land on his shoulder in the summer. Is it true? Probably not. Do I want to believe it? Absolutely. And yet, the fact that we even have these stories says a lot. In a culture built on rules, discipline, and carefully folded emotions, the simple act of listening became radical, subversive, healing. The shogun's secret meetings may never be confirmed, but that doesn't make them meaningless. They're like ghost footprints, traces of a tradition that mattered enough to survive in silence. Because sometimes the most powerful words are the ones that never leave the room. Let's talk about samurai for a second. When you picture one, you probably imagine a guy in gleaming armor, standing stoic in the rain, hand resting on his katana, eyes full of noble determination. You know, the usual action movie poster stuff. But here's a detail they don't show you. Sometimes, that same guy would sneak into a quiet tea house late at night, sit down, and cry. Silently, of course. Dignified sobbing. Maybe a single tear rolling down one cheek, like a dramatic haiku come to life. Because here's the truth no one carved into stone tablets. Samurai were human. And being human? Exhausting. Especially in a culture where emotions were supposed to be as tightly wrapped as your kimono sash. Samurai were expected to uphold Bushido, the way of the warrior, an ethical code centered around loyalty, discipline, honor, and, most annoyingly, emotional control. That sounds noble, but also suffocating. You could lose your head literally for acting dishonorably, and showing emotional vulnerability, that often was considered dishonorable. So when things got too heavy, when they lost comrades, when their lord turned cruel, when they started questioning the whole bloody point of it all, they needed an outlet. Enter the listener, a quiet, unassuming figure who sat in the shadows, never asked for names, and never, ever reacted. There's a well-preserved anecdote from the Edo period about a seasoned samurai who met with a listener once a month. After several years of silence, one evening he simply walked in, sat down, and said, "I cannot remember the sound of my mother's voice." And then he wept, not for dramatic effect, not because he was weak, but because there was finally a place where he could. It's hard to overstate how radical that was. In a society obsessed with face, with maintaining the right expression, tone, status, shedding a tear in front of someone could be more intimate than undressing. One historian called it the nakedness of the spirit. A little poetic, maybe, but not wrong. Now, this doesn't mean all samurai were closet softies. Many were genuinely committed to the warrior code, emotionally and philosophically. But even the most disciplined mind cracks under enough pressure. Death, shame, regret, they're universal burdens. And the higher your rank, the fewer people you could trust with your doubts. That's why the listeners were indispensable. Not just for what they did, but for what they didn't do. They didn't try to fix the samurai. They didn't tell them to meditate more or have you tried writing a haiku about it. They didn't offer wisdom or push for resolution. They just held the silence open like a bowl. And you'd be surprised how many warriors came back. Regularly. Some even had unofficial listening contracts, a quiet agreement that they would return after every campaign or major loss. In a few rare cases, the listener would travel with the Lord's retinue, posing as a servant or even a cook, just to be available when the emotional dam cracked. Now, you might wonder, why not just talk to other samurai? Well, pride and the fear of appearing weak. In a world where your life could hinge on another man's perception of your resolve, vulnerability was a currency you couldn't afford to spend. So instead, they invested in strangers with exceptional self-control. There's even a scroll written by a former listener, one of the few records we have from their side of the room. In it, he writes, "They came in silence, left in silence. But sometimes when they stood up, they were breathing like men pulled out of deep water." I love that image because it tells you everything. These weren't therapy sessions. There were no couches, no breakthroughs, no miraculous transformations. Just space, just breath, just being heard. And for a samurai, that was more relief than a hot bath, more liberating than 10 cups of sake. It was proof that under all that armor, emotional, social, and literal, there was still a person. Someone who just wanted to remember the sound of their mother's voice. By now you're probably thinking, okay, this whole listening gig sounds noble and mysterious, but how do they not mess it up? I mean, if someone's spilling their heart out to you, there's got to be some serious temptation and nod at the wrong time. Ask a dumb question or, blurt out asterisk, wait, what? You buried the swordware. Asterisk. But here's the thing. Listeners had rules. Strict ones. Unofficial. Mostly unspoken, but deadly serious. And at the center of it all, the 3 no's. Asterisco, asterisco, no asking. No yagging. No recording. Asterisk, asterisk. Let me break that down, because it's way more intense than it sounds. No asking meant you never led the conversation. If a client walked in and sat there for an hour without saying a word, guess what? That was the session. You don't prod. You don't say, "So, what's on your mind today, Lord Tanaka?" You wait. You become background noise with a heartbeat. No judging was harder. Much harder. Listeners heard things that probably made their eyebrows twitch, but they had to keep their faces neutral. A samurai could walk in and say he betrayed his own brother, and the listener's only response might be to pour more tea. Not because they didn't care, but because they had to stay safe for the speaker. And no recording? That was sacred. There were no notebooks, no tallies, no mental file cabinets. What was said in the tea room stayed there. That's why we have so few primary sources written by listeners themselves. Most took their stories to the grave. Now, there were consequences for breaking these rules. And while we don't have exact historical records of punishments, we do have the next best thing: rumors. One folktale tells of a listener who sold a noblewoman's confession to a rival clan. 2 weeks later, his house burned down mysteriously, and his name was never spoken again. Coincidence? Maybe. A very poetic warning parable? Absolutely. More credible is a story about an informal guild, or rather, a network, of listeners who operated under a kind of internal code. They called themselves Kikimimi no Mano, literally, those of the listening ear. If a member was caught gossiping or breaking the 3 no's, they'd be unheard. That was the term. Not punished. Not banished. Unheard. It meant being cut off from the network. Clients stopped coming. Tea houses refused to host you. You became invisible. In a profession built on quiet presence, being unheard was professional death. Academic circles still debate whether the Kikimimi no Mano were a real group or just an idealized invention. Some scholars argue they were similar to Ronin, independent, wandering, loyal to a code, but not to a master. Others suggest they had central meeting points, maybe even secret gestures or symbols, like a tap of the tea bowl to acknowledge another listener in the room. We don't know for sure, but the idea persists for a reason. Because even in silence, there needed to be structure. And it wasn't just about trust. It was about emotional hygiene. Listeners had to protect their clients, but also themselves. Imagine sitting with someone as they confess their darkest thoughts, then walking out and pretending none of it happened. Over and over, day after day. You couldn't carry that weight without a system. So they had rituals. Some listeners burned incense after sessions, not for the client, but for themselves, a way to smoke out the residual emotions. Others went to temples between clients, whispering their own confessions to stone statues that weren't required to stay silent. Some even practiced breath work or meditation, not for enlightenment, but just to reset. And there's one particularly charming tradition I stumbled across in a dusty footnote. A listener, after particularly heavy confessions, would write a short haiku, not about the session, but about something totally unrelated. A bird, a cracked teacup, the way the sun hit the moss outside. It was their way of returning to the world. Because if you held on to everyone else's secrets and didn't let them go somehow, they'd bury you. So yes, the 3 no's were about respect, but they were also about survival. The listener wasn't a sponge. They were a mirror, carefully polished and entirely non-stick. The secret wasn't in hearing everything. It was in letting it pass through. Because the moment you hold on, ask too much, judge too harshly, write something down, you stop being safe. And in that world, being safe was your entire brand. You might be thinking, asterisk, all right, I get it, emotional detox, secret keepers, samurai tears. But was this really a full-time job? Could someone actually make a living just by listening? Asterisk. Oh, absolutely. And in more ways than one. Because here's where things take a fascinating turn. Listening wasn't just emotional support. It was also business strategy. Let me paint the scene. Imagine you're a rising merchant in Osaka. You've got warehouses full of silk and enough coin to make even a minor lord say 'em. But there's a problem. Your potential trading partner is a grumpy old ironworks dealer who hasn't trusted anyone since his 3rd apprentice ran off with his ledger book. You need this deal, but every time you meet, the man just stares at his tea like it insulted his mother. So what do? You send him, very discreetly, to a listener. No, not as a trap, not to extract secrets, just to help him unload whatever's clogging his gears. You cover the fee. The listener, of course, doesn't mention your name. But 2 days later, your ironworks friend shows up to your meeting slightly less scowly. He doesn't smile, but he talks. A little. You strike a deal. Congratulations. You just used a listener the way modern executives use a golf retreat. In medieval Japan, emotional stability was productivity. But there wasn't exactly an HR department handing out mental health days. So, savvy merchants and ambitious retainers began quietly treating listeners like emotional maintenance workers. Clean the gears so the machine runs smoother. In fact, there's an old merchant's handbook, I kid you not, that includes a section titled Matters to be Heard Before Negotiation. It advises the reader to offer a trusted ear to the other party, if one exists, and even notes that some ears require payment in advance. That's how normalized this was. Listeners weren't just secret keepers. They were deal makers by proxy. But they didn't just help other people do business. Some of them got pretty good at using what they heard to manage their own side hustles. Let's be real. When you're the living inbox for half the city's secrets, you start to see patterns. You know which merchant families are struggling. You hear that Lord So-and-so is low on rice but high on ego. You don't repeat it, but you adjust your investments accordingly. Now, this walks a fine line. The best listeners never use their clients' confessions directly. That would destroy their credibility. But they became masters of soft awareness. They could sense the emotional climate of a district the way a sailor senses a storm. Should I invest in salt this winter? Should I hire more laborers next spring? Who's about to lose favor at court? They never said a word, but they always knew. And here's another twist. Some listeners weren't just receivers. They were introducers. Picture this. A listener meets with a noble woman distraught over her family's declining fortune. The next day, a wealthy widow arrives needing someone to manage her estate. Both confessions end with tears and tea. The listener connects them, quietly. No credit taken. No favors asked. Weeks later, the noblewoman is employed. The widow is relieved. The listener? Still sipping tea, still saying nothing. It's the oldest trick in the book, connecting dots without leaving fingerprints. Of course, this wasn't universal. Not every listener moonlighted as a social architect. But those who did, they wielded silent influence. They never raised a fan in a council meeting or entered a battlefield, but their presence lingered in decisions, appointments, and reconciliations across the city. Historians call this non-positional power, when someone without a formal title still shapes outcomes. And in the context of feudal Japan, where everything had a ritual and a rank, that kind of power was extraordinary. Naturally, it came with risks. Whispers started. Why does Lord Hironaka only trade with people who've spoken to the listener of Ueno? Why did the widow's estate go to a T, maid's cousin? Suspicion brewed. But proving anything was impossible, because listeners, by design, left no trail. They weren't priests. They weren't merchants. They weren't politicians. And yet, they moved within all three circles. By doing one thing over and over again. Listening. So yes, it was a job, a profession, a business. And in the hands of the wise, it was also a kind of quiet empire, built not with walls, but with open ears. Let's shift focus a bit, because up until now, we've mostly talked about samurai merchants, the heavy hitters, the armor wearers, the money havers. But what about women? Why, yes, the half of the population that history tends to write about in the footnotes, if it bothers to write about them at all. And yet, when it comes to professional listening in medieval Japan, women didn't just play a role, they quietly dominated. See, while most women in that era were locked out of public authority, political office, or even basic inheritance rights, they found creative ways to slip past the velvet ropes of society. One of those ways? Through the gentle art of listening. Now, let's be clear. In the rigid social structure of feudal Japan, women's voices were often muted, literally and figuratively. In many households, especially in noble or warrior classes, women were expected to be seen, not heard. Obedient, polite, decorative. You know, the usual soul-crushing expectations. But here's where it gets interesting. Because they weren't allowed to speak freely, they became masters at hearing. Women were often trained from a young age to read a room, observe micro-expressions, interpret tone shifts. It was a survival skill, especially in court life, where politics moved more through sideways glances and poetic phrases than sword fights. So when the role of the listener started to evolve into a profession, women stepped into that quiet space with remarkable ease. In fact, some of the most sought-after listeners in Kyoto were women, particularly older ones who had outlived husbands, renounced court life, or simply aged into social invisibility. With no more expectations to bear children or host dinner parties, they became something far more valuable, neutral territory. There's a famous line from a 16th century poem that goes, "She does not speak for herself, and thus we all speak to her." Elegant. Also incredibly efficient branding. And guess what? Female listeners had a unique advantage. They could be present in spaces male listeners never could. Bedrooms, bathhouses, inner courts, private chambers where noble women gossiped, mourned, or plotted. These women didn't just listen, they witnessed things that shaped dynasties. Naturally, this made some people uncomfortable. Powerful men began to whisper, what do they do in those rooms? What secrets pass in silence? But they couldn't stop it, because those same men often sent their wives, sisters, and daughters to these women when they didn't know how to deal with them. There's a letter from a Kyoto merchant, dated around 1570, addressed to his listener. It reads, "My wife does not weep in front of me, but she has wept with you. Thank you for hearing what I could not." Now let's pause on that for a second. This wasn't just a man outsourcing emotional labor. It was someone acknowledging that he wasn't a safe space, but someone else was. And yes, some female listeners also took male clients. In fact, many noblemen preferred them. Why? Because they were perceived as gentler, less threatening, and, let's be honest, better at reading emotional nuance. You can't exactly grunt at a problem and expect empathy. Of course, not everyone understood the boundaries. This is where we have to talk about the elephant in the tea room, the confusion between listening and intimacy. Because some people, mostly men, mistook attentive silence for flirtation. It's the classic, she laughed at my joke, so we must be soulmates scenario, feudal edition. But here's the truth. Most listeners, especially women, were fiercely professional. They had rules, distance, rituals. You didn't cross certain lines, or you were simply not invited back. And trust me, being blacklisted from Kyoto's emotional underground, that was the end of your polite social game. In fact, one female listener, nicknamed the long-haired sister, was so respected that wealthy families would request her by name. She was said to have a voice like falling snow and the ability to hold grief without blinking. There's no record of what she looked like or where she came from, but people wrote poems about how they felt after speaking to her. And no, she wasn't a courtesan. She didn't pour drinks or entertain. She simply listened. A tea house owner who hosted her once wrote, "She brought no perfume, no songs, only silence. And people paid more for that than they did for sake." Which raises a question we're still asking today. When did we start valuing distraction over presence? Because in a world that barely let women speak, the fact that they became the most trusted listeners, that's not just poetic justice. That's strategic genius. By now, you've probably noticed something. Everyone comes to a listener with a different story, a different rhythm, a different weight they need to set down. And if you were a good listener in medieval Japan, like really good, you didn't just hear the words. You tuned into the frequency. You matched the tempo. Because a nobleman with court troubles doesn't speak the same way as a rice merchant who just lost a shipment in a river. Different melodies, same need to be heard. One former listener, anonymous of course, once wrote, "When a man speaks of dreams, you listen like a monk. When he speaks of money, you listen like a banker. When he speaks of love, you say nothing and just let him burn through it." And that's the art of emotional code switching, centuries before we ever had a term for it. Let's break it down. Noblemen, for example, often spoke in riddles. Everything had to be poetic, wrapped in metaphor, and sometimes so indirect that you could sit through an entire session and still not be 100% sure what their actual problem was. One might say, the chrysanthemum wilts earlier this season, though no frost has touched it. Which, translated, meant, my son has disappointed me, and I'm thinking about disinheriting him. The listener wouldn't ask follow-up questions. They just tilt their head slightly, maybe pour more tea, and let the silence bloom into understanding. Now compare that with merchants. Their problems were much more numeric. My partner lied about the shipping costs. We're short by 30 can. If the Sakanoya family pulls out, we're done. There's less metaphor, more tension in the jaw, less tea sipping, more pacing. These sessions were shorter, but more intense, like someone was unloading a ledger straight into the air. But even within these patterns, every person was different, and a good listener knew how to adjust. You couldn't just go into each session with the same silent and wise posture like some emotional statue. You had to read the client, the rhythm, the temperature of the room. There's a record of a listener who wore different colored robes, depending on who they were meeting. Not for show, but for tone setting. Deep blue for grief, soft beige for restlessness, dark green for conversations that might go somewhere dark. Historians argue about whether this was widespread practice or just that one listener's eccentric flair, but either way, it shows how layered the job could be. One especially fascinating account comes from a retired swordsmith who became a listener after an injury made forging impossible. He noted, the loudest clients were always the quietest at heart. They needed the silence more than they realized. What he meant was, the people who came in ranting and pacing weren't the ones trying to make noise. They were trying to drown out something. A fear, a regret, a memory they hadn't said aloud yet. So the listener's job? Let them burn through the storm, then catch the quiet that came after. This is where the real skill came in, because anyone can sit and nod, but staying present, really present, while someone talks themselves through grief, shame, or confusion. That takes training, or trauma, or both. Some listeners meditated to keep their minds still. Others kept mental checklists, tiny rituals to ground themselves during longer monologues. Some even learned to breathe in rhythm with the client, so they could anchor the conversation without interrupting. And you know what? It worked, because by the end of each session, no matter who walked in, a lord, a widow, or runaway monk, they usually left the same way, breathing a little slower, standing a little straighter, looking like someone who had just found the floor beneath their feet again. So yeah, different people came in with different voices. But the best listeners? They became fluent in all of them. Now, by this point, you're probably wondering, did these listeners just magically appear one day, fully enlightened and able to sit through hours of emotional monologue without blinking? Not even close. You know that old saying, still waters run deep? Well, in the case of professional listeners, still waters were also trained. And where did that training happen? Temples. Yep, those quiet, incense-filled, bell-chiming sanctuaries scattered across Japan weren't just places for chanting and contemplating the impermanence of all things. They were, in some cases, unofficial training grounds for some of the most composed emotional sponges in medieval society. Not all listeners were monks, of course, but many of the best ones had spent time in temples, either as young acolytes or later in life after some dramatic fallout, like losing a duel, a spouse, or just the will to keep working in a rice tax office. Happens. The training was never called listener school or anything flashy like that. It wasn't even always formal, but it existed in the form of discipline, repetition, and long periods of not talking. Imagine this. You're 15, assigned to sweep gravel paths at 5 a.m., serve tea to stone-faced monks who say 5 words a day, and meditate under a freezing waterfall for half an hour before breakfast. No phone, no music, no podcasts, just silence. Hours of it, days of it. You either go mad or you get really good at sitting with yourself. And once you're good at that, it turns out you're surprisingly equipped to sit with other people's chaos too. In fact, some temples had entire side disciplines focused on listening, not for counseling, but as part of spiritual development. It was believed that by fully receiving another person's thoughts without reaction or resistance, you were practicing a form of non-self, letting their thoughts move through you like wind through bamboo. That's beautiful and all, but let's be honest, it also sounds really hard. There's a scroll from a Zen temple in Nara that describes a young monk who, during a 3-day silence retreat, broke down crying halfway through day 2, not from sadness, but because he realized he'd never really listened to his own thoughts before. He later became a renowned listener in the imperial court. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe that's just how it works. Temples also taught breath control, which, if you've ever had to sit across from someone venting for an hour straight without looking overwhelmed, is basically a cheat code. Deep, slow breathing helped listeners stay grounded, not just emotionally, but physically. You don't realize how tense your shoulders get until you're trying to absorb someone else's existential spiral without reacting. And let's not forget posture. One of the simplest signs of a seasoned listener, they could sit still for hours without fidgeting. Why? Because movement breaks the spell. Listeners weren't performers, but they were creating a space, a mood. A small gesture, a nervous twitch, even an eyebrow raise could derail the delicate trust being built. So they learned, through temple discipline or sheer repetition, to become still. And that stillness was powerful. There's even a recorded phrase used in certain temples. To hear without hearing, to feel without reacting, to sit like a mountain in the storm. Some historians believe that was the unofficial motto for temple-trained listeners. Others think it was just poetic flair. Either way, it captures the vibe. Of course, not everyone trained this way. Some listeners learned through experience. Trial, error, emotional bruises. But the temple-trained ones? They were the gold standard. The silent elites. It got to the point where certain clients requested listeners with monastic backgrounds, believing their presence was more calming, more neutral. One daimyo even insisted that all listeners who entered his estate had spent at least one winter in silence. Which, honestly, would make a great t-shirt. And here's a little fun fact. Some temples still offer courses on active listening, rooted in these ancient traditions. They don't call it training for professional ears, but the lineage is there. So no, they didn't just pop out of the tatami floor fully enlightened. They practiced, they breathed, they listened to themselves first, and only then were they ready to listen to everyone else. So let's get something out of the way, because it's the kind of question that always bubbles up around now. Asterisk. Weren't these listeners just fancy courtesans? Or part-time entertainers? Or, not so subtle participants in the night economy? Asterisk. And hey, it's a fair question. On the surface, the idea of someone sitting quietly, gazing at you while you pour your heart out in a candlelit room, sounds intimate. A little too intimate, maybe. But here's the truth. Listening was not flirting. It wasn't entertainment. And it definitely wasn't romance. In fact, professional listeners worked very hard to make sure you knew that. Yes, some of them operated out of tea houses. And yes, sometimes those tea houses were in the same neighborhoods as pleasure quarters. But that's where the similarities ended. While geisha and courtesans were trained in music, conversation, and elegance, with a strong current of performance, listeners were trained in silence, stillness, holding emotional weight, not attention. If anything, comparing a professional listener to a courtesan was like comparing a priest to a stage actor. They both deal with people. One is there to dazzle. The other is there to disappear. And that disappearing act? It was intentional. The listener's job was to fade into the room, not become the center of it. Now, that didn't stop people from projecting. There were plenty of clients who mistook the quiet empathy of a good listener for affection. And to be fair, when someone hears your darkest fears without flinching, it's easy to feel seen in a way that feels personal, even romantic. But most listeners had boundaries carved into stone. Metaphorically, some would state them up front. I'm here to listen, nothing more. Others let the silence do the work. If a client veered into inappropriate territory, they'd simply stop responding. Not angrily, not awkwardly, just still. There's a wonderful old saying that goes, the true listener leaves no shadow in the room, which is a poetic way of saying, don't get attached, buddy. And let's be honest, there were a few who blurred the line. Just like in any profession, some listeners operated in the gray areas, offering a bit more attention, a bit more closeness, especially if the client was generous with coin or came from powerful family. But those weren't the respected ones. They weren't the ones samurai requested after battle, or that widows confided in when they couldn't sleep. They were seen as deluded, performers pretending to be something deeper. In the best tea houses, listeners weren't allowed to touch clients. Not a hand on the shoulder, not even a sleeve brush. Why? Because even the hint of physical contact risked muddying the waters. Listeners had to be clean vessels, not just emotionally, but symbolically. And that meant staying clear of the messy, more tangled cords of attraction and desire. That's not to say they weren't admired. Some were, deeply. There are entire scrolls and poems praising a listener's voice or stillness, or the way they seem to understand without words. But those poems always end the same way, with distance, with quiet, with the poet walking away, lighter but alone. Even the names clients gave them reflected that distance. Lady of Silence, the ear behind the screen, the gentle absence. None of these names scream seduction. They speak of reverence, of gratitude, and yes, maybe of longing, but the kind that passes like steam off a teacup. Warm, beautiful, but never meant to last. And in a world where everything had a label, concubine, geisha, performer, the listener was always just out of reach. They didn't fit into a box. That was their power. So no, they weren't courtesans. They weren't entertainers. They were something far rarer. They were a presence you paid for and couldn't keep. Here's a weird thing to imagine. A room full of professional listeners talking to each other. I know. It sounds like a paradox wrapped in a haiku. What do they even say? So, here, anything interesting lately? Pause. Sips tea. Silence. But it turns out, listeners didn't always exist in isolation. While most of their work was done alone, one-on-one, hushed, discreet, there were moments, rare and delicate, when they came together. Not as competitors, not as employees, but as quiet comrades in the business of bearing other people's burdens. And what did they do when they gathered? They listened to each other. These meetings weren't common. You couldn't just crash into one like it was karaoke night at the local izakaya. Most of the time, they were whispered about, scheduled in cryptic ways. An extra tea bowl left outside a door, a folded fan in a particular pattern on a mat, a note with no name. And the place? Always somewhere private. A garden house behind a temple. A back room in a tea house no longer in business. Sometimes even by a riverbank at night. The sessions had a simple structure. One listener would speak. The rest would not comment. No feedback. No questions. Just the rare permission to finally say, here's what I've been carrying. Because here's something we don't talk about enough. When your entire profession is absorbing other people's pain, secrets, guilt, and sorrow, what do you do with it afterward? Exactly. You need somewhere to put it. These listener-to-listener meetings were like emotional recycling centers. Everyone brought their leftovers, their fragments, their most haunting lines. There's a beautifully sparse record from one such gathering in 1642, passed down through the notes of a temple scribe. One entry reads, "The woman from the western gate spoke for 47 minutes. She told no story, just sounds, half-formed thoughts. She cried. We let her. And then, afterward, she left 3 coins by the mat. None of us touched them. That's it. No resolution. No grand insight. Just presence. It's like listeners had their own private world, one where even silence needed caretakers. Some of these groups operated informally. Just a few trusted people meeting once every few seasons. But there are faint traces of something more organized. Something that might have been a network or even a kind of guild. They didn't have a name, at least not one recorded officially. But in the margins of a few merchant logs and court papers, the same strange phrase keeps popping up. Ear for an ear. Now don't panic. This isn't some feudal revenge pact. It was their way of saying, asterisk, I'll hold your silence if you'll hold mine. Asterisk, not a transaction, not even a favor, just mutual understanding among people who knew how heavy silence could be. And yes, sometimes they'd exchange stories, carefully anonymized, stripped of identity, reshaped like parables. Not for gossip, for calibration, because listeners, despite their composure, could get stuck. You hear the same kind of grief too many times, and it starts to echo. So they'd pass each other a new tone, a different rhythm. Here's something you haven't heard before. It refreshed their mental palate, like drinking cold water after hours of tea. In rare cases, older listeners would mentor younger ones. Not in the this is how you nod meaningfully way, but more like here's how I survived my 5th year without disappearing into the people I was listening to. One elder reportedly told a student, "You're not a sponge. You're a river. Let it pass through you." Simple advice, deep wisdom. And of course, there were rules. Even among each other, listeners avoided names. They didn't discuss clients directly. There was no comparing confessions, no rating stories by drama. That would have broken the very fabric of what they stood for. But they did share silence. And sometimes silence shared back. So yes, even listeners needed to be heard. Because in the end, no one, asterisk, not even the quietest person in the room, asterisk, can carry it all alone. By now, you might be thinking, if listeners were so deeply woven into the emotional and social fabric of medieval Japan, what happened to them? Where did they go? Because let's be honest, you don't see job listings these days for emotionally neutral tea house presence. Must have excellent posture and deep respect for silence. The answer, like most things in history, is complicated and quietly heartbreaking. The truth is, listeners didn't disappear all at once. They faded. The beginning of the end came with the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, a sweeping series of reforms that yanked Japan into the modern age at breakneck speed. Western clothes, Western institutions, Western psychology. With the push for modernization, everything had to be measured, documented, systematized. Silence, intuition, the subtle wisdom of a gaze over a steaming teacup, those didn't fit on a government ledger. And as new roles emerged, Therapists, counselors, educators, the quiet, ancient art of just being there got edged out. It's not that people stopped needing listeners. Far from it. But the shape of listening changed. It became structured, clinical, categorized. Sessions had objectives. Notes were taken. Labels applied. And while that brought incredible breakthroughs in mental health, something was lost along the way. You could call it mystery, or grace, or simply room to speak without needing to be understood. Listeners had never required a diagnosis. They never offered solutions. They didn't want to fix you. They just gave you space to be a little broken without breaking entirely. But in the new Japan, the value of that became harder to explain. And yet, they didn't vanish completely. Even today, if you wander into certain older tea houses in Kyoto or Nara, you might find someone who sits behind the counter, pours you tea, and says very little. You might talk about your day, your regrets, your grandmother's strange dream. They won't nod too much. They won't offer advice. But when you leave, you'll feel a little lighter, like you've stepped out of your own skull for a moment and into a room where your thoughts didn't echo back too loud. A few of these people are descendants of old listening families. Others found their way into the tradition by instinct, by temperament, by the quiet tug of something older than language. One tea house owner in Kanazawa, when asked if she was a listener, just smiled and said, "I serve tea. And sometimes people leave their sadness in the cup." And yes, the practice still carries risk. There's no license for this kind of thing. No formal training program. Just one human being showing up day after day, offering their attention like a gift no one knows how to wrap. Even in modern psychology circles, there's renewed interest in what's now being called non-directive presence. That idea of being available without steering, supporting without solving. Funny, right? We're looping back around. Some historians say we'll never recover what was lost. That the old listening traditions were too culturally specific, too delicately balanced between ritual and instinct. But others disagree. They believe the spirit of it lives on, quietly, stubbornly, in the corners of our fast-talking world. In coffee shops, on long bus rides, in midnight calls with someone who says, "You don't have to explain. Just talk. I'm here." And maybe that's the point. Maybe the art of listening doesn't need to be preserved in museums or textbooks. Maybe it just needs someone, anyone, to sit still once in a while, pour the tea, and say, "You can begin whenever you're ready." So here we are, at the edge of a story that began in the shadows of Kyoto, drifted through silent temples, survived whispered secrets in moonlit tea houses, and now rests gently in our ears, centuries later. And I can't help but ask, do we still know how to listen? I mean really listen. Not the kind where you're half glancing at your phone while someone unpacks their soul. Not the kind where you're already crafting your reply before they finish the first sentence. But the kind that sits quietly, without fixing, without judgment, just present. If I'm being honest, I don't think we've lost the need for listeners. If anything, we need them more than ever. We live in a world full of noise. Posts, comments, alerts, likes, group chats, voice memos. Everybody's talking, all the time, and yet, somehow, we still feel unheard. We've built cities of conversation, but barely a single room for true listening. But here's the twist. Even though the old listening guilds are gone, even though there's no longer a title for this quiet craft, it's still here. In the friend who lets you talk for 40 minutes straight about something dumb and makes you feel better anyway. In the grandmother who doesn't interrupt when you rant about work, even though she doesn't know what a spreadsheet is. In the stranger who nods at just the right moment, making you feel seen. And maybe, just maybe, we are still part of that lineage. Untrained, unpolished, but linked all the same. There's something beautiful about that idea, that in a way, the spirit of the medieval listener never really disappeared. It just scattered, found its way into quiet people in loud rooms, into kind eyes across coffee tables, into the silence between, "How are you?" and the moment someone finally answers honestly. So no, we don't have listening tea houses anymore. But maybe we don't need them. Maybe what we need is to become one. To be the quiet space someone else steps into. To be the room where their words can land softly. To be the cup that holds what they can't carry for a while. You don't need incense. You don't need a title. You just need time and stillness and a little willingness to say, I'm here. Go ahead. Because in the end, the most powerful magic isn't the talking. It's being heard. Now that we've wandered through the quiet corridors of this forgotten tradition, let's let the noise slip away. The story is told. The tea is cooled. And the room, I hope, feels just a little softer now. Maybe you're lying in bed, lights low, your phone resting a little heavier in your hand. Maybe the fan hums gently in the corner, and the night is finally quiet enough to hear your own breathing. Let that be enough. Let the silence settle in your chest like warm water. Let the world outside pause for just a while. You don't have to hold anything right now. Not the to-do list, not the regret, not the ache of being misunderstood. Tonight, you've been heard, even if you didn't say a word. And if tomorrow comes rushing in again, loud and demanding, just remember, there's always space somewhere to rest your voice, or to offer that space for someone else. For now, though, you don't have to do anything. Just breathe and dream.